Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing reading from Swiss Family Robinson, getting close to the end, but we have a few more chapters to go. We're starting today with chapter 53, The Redoubt, Valuable Discoveries, the Cacao Tree, the Banana, Crocodiles and Alligators, Tea Plant, Artillery and Fortification of Shark Island. Excuse me. Our next labor was to construct some sort of a fort to shelter us whenever we might visit the defile. We had not strength enough to build a regular fort, and besides, our knowledge of fortification was very limited. At last, Fritz thought of a plan of a Kamschatdale fort, which he had read of somewhere, and which I thought, with a little improvement, would answer admirably. The Kamschatdale fort simply consists of 4 high stones upon which are laid planks and boards, forming a platform upon which a hut of bark or branches is constructed. Not a very formidable fortress, certainly, but yet capable of defending us in case of an attack from wild beasts. Instead of 4 stones for the foundation, we chose out 4 trees to answer the same purpose. We did not cut the branches off close, but left them as rests for the beams of our platform. We surrounded our platform with a high and strong network of rushes and branches, leaving an opening for entrance, and we covered the roof with the waterproof leaves of the talipot palm. These leaves grow so large that 10 men can be covered by one of them. Our fort bore a strong resemblance to Falcon's Nest, and surrounded as it was by green trees and flourishing verdure, it did not look much like a military construction. To ascend to the platform, we employed one of the simplest means I could imagine. It was by a beam which descended perpendicularly to the ground and notched deeply into steps. We also arranged this so that it could be raised and lowered at pleasure. Fritz and Jack promised themselves wonders from our new fort, which overlooked the savannah for a great distance, and we could see the river running like a silver thread through the immense plain, and by means of spyglasses, we could discern troops of buffaloes and other animals feeding around the brink. Our labors at the fort were diversified by some important discoveries. One day, Fritz made an excursion to the river of the savannah and found among the rich vegetation there some unknown shrubs, of which he brought me specimens to examine. One kind bore in large clusters a beautiful green fruit, tipped at the end with violet and shaped like a large gherkin. The others were covered with quantities of small flowers interspersed with large fruits like cucumbers. On examination, I recognized them as being 2 of the most precious productions of the tropics. The largest of the fruits was the cacao bean, of which chocolate is made. The other was the banana, that forms an article of food for the inhabitants of several countries in America. We tasted these far-famed fruits, but did not find them very excellent. The beans of the cacao are filled with a sort of viscous matter like thick cream, but of an insipid taste and an odor like that of an overripe pear. My wife, who had opened several bananas, sought in vain for some seeds which she might take home to plant in her kitchen garden. I told her that the banana contained no seeds and was always propagated from cuttings, which will easily grow if planted in rich, wet earth. My wife also wished to plant some of the cacao beans in her garden, but she was obliged to renounce her project, as Ernest told her that unless the seeds were put in when the fruit was gathered, they would be useless. It was resolved in consequence that Fritz should set out the next day in his Cacao and go in search of the elements necessary for the reproduction of these 2 precious plants. My wife never forgot her kitchen garden, and whenever she came across a useful addition, she immediately planted a specimen there. The next day, Fritz embarked, and fearing that his Cacao would not be large enough to hold the cargo he intended to bring home, he fastened a raft of rushes behind it. He was ashamed, he said, to go for some banana cuttings only, and he intended to bring home something else. We occupied ourselves during the day in preparing to set out for Felsenheim, and Fritz did not return till late in the evening when we saw him coming toward us, the Cacao and the raft loaded down to the water's edge. "Bravo! Bravo!" cried his brothers as they saw Fritz advancing laden with green branches. The cargo was soon unloaded and dragged up to the hut with as much contentment as if it had been the galleons of silver that Admiral Anson captured. Fritz now came up, holding in his hand a superb bird, the feet and wings of which he had fastened, and which he presented to us as the principal booty of the day. It was the Sultan cock of Buffon, the king of waterfowls, so called from its beauty of form and the brilliancy of its plumage. I easily recognized its long red legs and its beautiful green and violet plumage with a red spot in the forehead. My wife wished to add it to the inhabitants of the farmyard, and as it was very gentle, it soon became as tame as the rest of our domestic fowls, who appeared jealous of the newcomer. Fritz now recounted to us the details of the day. he informed us that he had ascended the river for a great distance, and that he had been astonished at the majestic forests which bordered it and threw a somber shade over its waters. He had encountered several families of turkeys, pintados, and peacocks, whose cries and screams imparted an air of life to the somber river. Farther on, the scene had changed. There were enormous elephants feeding along the bank in troops of 20 or 30. Some were playing in the water and squirting the cooling fluid over the heated bodies of their companions. Tigers and panthers, too, lay sleeping in the sun, their magnificent fur contrasting strangely with the green bank upon which they reclined. But not one of these animals paid the least attention to the young navigator. "I felt my inability and weakness," said Fritz, "on finding myself face to face with these terrible enemies. My gun, my balls, and my skill would have been of little use, and I thought I had better retrace my steps. I commenced to turn my Cacao round, when what was my surprise to see, at about the distance of 2 gunshots before me, a long and large mouth, armed with rows of formidable teeth, and the whole apparatus moving directly toward me. I cannot say how I found strength enough to escape. I felt so frightened at the apparition. I took a lesson then in natural history that I have no desire soon to repeat." "What animal was it?" asked Francis, the mouth and teeth of which Fritz saw coming out of the water. "An alligator, probably," said Ernest, "or if you would prefer, using a name more familiar to you, a crocodile." We finished our preparations for departure and set off at break of day the next morning for Felsenheim. Fritz asked my permission to allow him to make the journey by water in his Cacao and to return home by Dublin Cape Disappointment. I readily consented, as the ease with which he managed his little boat gave me nothing to fear, and besides, I was anxious to know more about the Cape. We both set out at the same time, and both arrived home safely. The sailor, in doubling the Cape, had made 2 new discoveries. Among the bushes which covered the rock, he remarked 2 shrubs, one of which was covered with very highly scented rose-colored flowers, and had long, narrow leaves. The other had numerous small white flowers, and in its whole appearance very much resembled the myrtle. He brought home to us specimens of these 2 shrubs, one of which my wife recognized as the caper tree, used in pickling. The other was a sort of Chinese tea plant, which was received with marked distinction. When we were a little rested from our fatigue, my wife recalled to mind Falcon's Nest and its aerial chateau, which we had almost forgotten since our discovery of the salt cavern. "It is wrong," said she, "to let that beautiful habitation go to ruin. Although Felsenheim offers us a sure protection in winter, yet Falcon's Nest, with its gigantic branches and pleasant verdure, is the most agreeable habitation we could possess." My wife spoke reasonably, and I promised her that I would do as she wished. We left Felsenheim and took up our residence in our old habitation. The roof that we had made over the roots was now plastered with gum and resin. The staircase was repaired. We substituted a bark roof for the old linen one over our chamber in the tree. We made a balcony all around it and repaired everything so that it was a clean, agreeable habitation. But the embellishments at Falcon's Nest were but a prelude to more considerable and difficult works. Fritz had conceived the idea of fortifying Shark Island and making that a sort of rallying point in case of danger. He teased me so about it, and his head was so full of plans and projects, that it was impossible to resist him, and the work was at length begun. One can easily conceive how great were the obstacles that a man and 4 boys had to contend with in order to convey 2 cannons to the island and level them on a platform more than 50 feet in height. It cost us immense labor even to effect the transport of the cannons. I then placed on the platform we had built a large capstan, and to shorten the time and reduce the labor in passing round the rock, I let down a rope made into loops so that we could easily ascend and descend. The cannons were attached by strong ropes and then hauled up by the capstan. This work cost us a whole day of hard labor, but at last the cannons were landed on the platform and established with their mouths toward the sea. We placed a long pole in the rock with a string and pulley so that we could hoist up a flag at any time. How glad we felt when our work was done, and how proud we were of our ingenuity. When we had crowned this military construction with a flag, a cry of joy was uttered, and as economical as I felt we must be in powder, 6 times we fired our cannons, and the rocks repeated the echo over a vast extent of ocean. Chapter 54, a general review of the colony after 10 years of establishment. It is with dismay that I cast my eyes over the number of pages I have filled, and which every day grow more numerous. Although I should like to mention the minutest details of our domestic life, yet I have some consideration for my readers who would throw down the book in disgust and grow weary of the monotony of the design. Therefore, I must content myself with merely describing our principal occupations. 10 years have passed away since we were thrown on this coast, each year resembling the preceding one in the similarity of its works. We had our fields to sow, our harvest to gather, and our domestic cares to attend to. These form the almost unbroken circle of our existence. My only desire is that the end I intended in writing this journal may be fulfilled, and that my readers, if I ever have any, may learn how, with God's blessing, to provide for their necessities when thrown, as we have been, entirely on their own resources. Providence had willed that the land of our exile should be in one of the most favored quarters of the globe, and every day we offered up our thanks to him for his goodness and beneficent kindness toward us. The 10 years we had passed were but years of conquest and establishment. We had constructed 3 habitations, built a solid wall across the defile, which would secure us against invasion from the wild beasts which infested the savannah. The part of the country in which we dwelt was defended by high mountains on one side and the ocean on the other. We had traversed the whole extent and rested in perfect surety that no enemy lurked within. Our principal habitations were beautiful, commodious, and especially very healthy. Felsenheim was a safe retreat for us during the storms of winter, while Falcon's Nest was our summer residence and country villa. Walled Egg, Prospect Hill, and even the establishment at the defile were like the quiet farmhouses that the traveler finds in the mountains of our own dear Switzerland. The remembrance of our native land is never obliterated from the mind. The love of one's birthplace is a love that survives youth and exists in all its ardor in the bosom of the old man. Of all our resources, the bees had prospered most. Experience had taught me how to manage them, and the only trouble that I had was to provide new hives each year for the increasing swarms. And in truth, so great was the number of our hives that they attracted a considerable flock of those birds called merops, or bee-eaters, who are extremely fond of these insects. We finished the gallery, which extended along the front of our grotto. A roof was made to the rock above it, and it rested on 14 columns of light bamboo, which gave it an elegant and picturesque appearance. Large pillars supported the gallery, around which twined the aromatic vines of the vanilla and the pepper, and each end of the gallery was terminated by a little cabinet with elevated roofs, having the appearance of Chinese pavilions surrounded by flowers and foliage. A flight of steps led up into the gallery, which we had paved with a sort of stone so soft when dug out as to be cut with a chisel, but hardening rapidly in the sun. The environs of our habitation were rich and agreeable. Our plantations had perfectly succeeded, and between the grotto and the bay was a grove of trees and shrubs, planted in tasteful confusion, which gave the spot the aspect of an English garden. Shark Island no longer was an arid bank of sand. Palm and pineapple trees had been planted everywhere, and the earth was covered with a carpet of vivid green, while far above the trees towered a staff, upon the top of which the Swiss flag floated gaily in the breeze. Our European trees had grown with a strength and rapidity of vegetation almost incredible, but their fruits had lost their flavor, and whether because the soil or the air was unfavorable, the apples and pears became black and withered. The plums and apricots were nothing but hard kernels surrounded by a tough skin. On the other hand, the indigenous productions multiplied 100-fold. The bananas, the figs, the guavas, the oranges, and the citron made our corner of the island a complete terrestrial paradise, where all the riches of vegetation were assembled. But the abundance of fruit brought on another plague. Multitudes of pillagers in the shape of birds flocked to the spot. We kept our bird snares always ready, and it sometimes happened that an unknown animal would be taken in the trap. For example, the great squirrel of Canada, remarkable for its beautiful tufted tail and lustrous red skin, attracted hither probably by our almonds and chestnuts. Paroquets, in all their diversity of colors, would sometimes be caught. Blue jays, thrushes, yellow laureates abounded plentifully, to the great prejudice of our cherries, figs, and native grapes. Besides the birds by day, there were other destroyers by night, and we had a great deal of trouble to dislodge a nest of flying squirrels that had taken up their residence in the topmost branches of one of our finest trees. Our beautiful flowers also attracted numerous guests. These were the hummingbirds, and it was one of our greatest amusements to watch these little birds flying around us, sparkling like precious stones and hardly perceptible by the quickness of their motions. It was an amusing spectacle to see these passionate, choleric little fellows attack others twice their size and drive them away from their nests, and at other times they would tear in pieces the unlucky flower that had deceived their expectations of a rich feast. These little scenes diverted us, and we endeavored to induce the birds to remain in our neighborhood by fixing little pots of honey on the branches and planting the flowers we observed they preferred. Our cares were recompensed. Several couples suspended their little nests lined with soft cotton to the branches of the vanilla, which wound around the columns of the gallery, or on the vines of the pepper, the perfume of which is very enticing to the hummingbird. The making of sugar was an object of our special attention, and we gradually improved our manufacture. Not that I can say we crystallized it as done in the refineries, but we obtained a very satisfactory result. We had saved from the wreck of the ship many articles intended for a sugar factory. Among others, 3 metal cylinders with which to press the sugar cane, 3 great kettles to boil the liquid in, and ladles and skimmers in abundance. The press was fixed under a perpendicular screw, working in connection with the cylinders. The whole turned by a lever passed horizontally through the screw and moved by one of our beasts of burden. Whale Island had not been neglected. We embellished it with trees and shrubs, but it was here that we always performed our less cleanly avocations, such as the preparation of fish, the melting of fat, the tannery, and the candle making. The materials for these works were kept under an overhanging rock which protected them from the sun and storm. Our cares were divided between these different establishments, without neglecting those that were more distant from us, and which we called our colonies. At Waldeck, we transformed the swamp into a superb rice field, which repaid our labor by plentiful harvests. We also planted cinnamon, which yielded us an ample return. Prospect Hill also had its share of attention. For each year, when the capers were ripe, we made an excursion thither and gathered a large quantity, which my wife preserved in spice and vinegar. And when the tea plant began to put forth its leaves, again we set out, and gathering enough for our use, we took it home to my wife, who with her youngest son occupied herself in rolling, drying, and preparing it for use. We made from time to time an excursion to the defile of the savannah, so that we might see whether any elephants or other hurtful beasts had penetrated into our plantations. Fritz then made an excursion in his kajak up the river of the savannah, and brought back to us a rich cargo of ginseng, cacao, and bananas. As Fritz had discovered in the woods near the defile traces of birds which from their noise and form he judged to be heathcocks, we resolved one day to have a grand hunt after the manner of the Cape colonists. For this purpose, we constructed a large quadrangle of the enormous bamboo canes I have spoken of, piled upon one another until the edifice was 10 feet long and 6 high, and exactly resembled an enormous bird cage. The top was covered with a lattice of canes, and the door formed of the same. To induce the birds to enter, we dug a deep ditch which led like a mine under a city wall into the center of the edifice. We covered this ditch with sticks and earth and placed in the exterior entrance, all along the passage, different sorts of grain. We then retire, and the birds precipitated themselves on the food. The more they ate, the deeper they buried themselves in the ditch, which at last, when they arrived at the end, they found themselves captured, and in vain they beat their heads against the trellis work. We entered and soon took them all prisoners. The family of Turk and Flora had each year been increased by a certain number of young dogs, which, notwithstanding the brilliant qualities they displayed, we were obliged to throw into the water, as to have allowed them to live would have been our own destruction. To this rule there was but one exception, and on the earnest entreaty of Jack, I permitted the canine family to retain one new member, which we called Coco, because, said Jack, the vowel O is the most sonorous, and will sound so fine in the forests. The female buffalo and the cow had each year produced us a scion from their race, but we had only raised one heifer and a second bull. We had called the cow Blanche on account of her pale yellow color, and the bull Thunder, as his voice was so powerful. We also possessed 2 more asses, which we named Arrow and Alert on account of the swiftness of their course. Our pigs were as wild as ever. The old sow had been dead many years, but she had bequeathed to her posterity a spirit of savage independence that all our exertions could not modify. Our other beasts had multiplied in the same proportion, so that we could often kill one without any fear of impoverishing ourselves. Such was the state of the colony 10 years after our arrival on the coast. Our resources had multiplied as our industry increased. Abundance reigned around us. We were as familiar with our part of the island as a farmer with his farm. It was a perfect paradise. It would have been an Eden, but there was one great void. Oh, if we could but have looked upon men, our brothers. For 10 years we had watched both by sea and land for some traces of man's existence, but all in vain, and yet we hoped on, hoped ever, and still gathered up all our treasures of cotton, and spices, and ostrich plumes, etc., in earnest hope that some day we might again see the blessed face of man. My sons were no longer children. Fritz had become a strong and vigorous man, although not tall, yet his limbs had been developed by exercise. He was 24 years of age. Ernest was 23, and although of a good constitution, he was not so strong as his brother. His reflective mind had ripened. Reason now aided his studious disposition. He had conquered his habit of idleness and was, in a word, a well-informed young man of a sound judgment and unquestionably the light of the family. Jack had but little changed. He was as headlong at 20 as at 10, but he excelled in corporeal exercises. Francis was 18. He was stout and tall. His character, without any predominant trait, was estimable. He was reflective without being as deep as Ernest, agile and skillful, but without surpassing Jack or Fritz. In general, my sons were good and honest men with sound principles and a deep sense of religion. My dear Elizabeth had not grown very old. As for me, my hair had become whitened by age. Or, so to speak more justly, there were but a few scattering locks left. The heat of the climate and excessive fatigue had taken them all away, although I still felt young and vigorous. There was one bitter, sad thought that always haunted my mind, and turning my eyes to heaven, I would often say, My God, who didst save us from shipwreck, and hast surrounded us with so many blessings, still watch over us, I pray thee, and do not let those perish in solitude whom thy hand has saved. We'll stop there and start next time with chapter 55. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.